Welcome back to Tanya in 5. The last few days, we have been studying chapter 11 of book 3 of Tanya, Iggeret HaTeshuva. In the previous chapter, we described the two levels of Teshuva and the transition between the first and the second. The first level of Teshuva comes with a sense of feeling compassion and pity on the mistakes we have done, and thus is somewhat self-critical. And from there, we transition to the higher level of Teshuva, which is the soul completely reattaching itself to God with all of his mind and heart. And this Teshuva is full of joy, knowing the opportunity we have to cleave and become one with God himself. In chapter 11 now, the Alter Rebbe adds layers to the joy that comes along with Teshuva. Number 1, says the Alter Rebbe, joy can exist simultaneous with a sense of self-pity if the two come from different places and for different reasons. I have self-pity because of past mistakes and because of what I've done to my soul with sin. The joy, however, comes from a different place. This comes from the place within me that is reattaching itself to God now. So really, in some sense, these two feelings can exist simultaneously because they come from different spaces within me. Furthermore, says the Alter Rebbe, one must know confidently that the moment a person does Teshuva with his whole heart, the moment a person makes a decision, I am abandoning sin and returning to the way of God, and I do so wholeheartedly, knowing how pitiful that sin was and what I caused in my soul and to God in that sin. The moment I make such a decision to return to the path of God, God instantaneously forgives me completely and totally. Even though I may ask God multiple times for this forgiveness, each time God forgives me wholeheartedly. Why am I so confident? Where do I know this from? Says the Alter Rebbe, every day in our prayer, 3 times a day, we make a blessing in the Amidah. Blessed are you, God, who compassionately forgives. Chanon hamarbel islayach. Now, Jewish law is that we don't make a blessing if we are in doubt. And therefore, if we make a blessing thanking God for forgiveness, then we are confident he forgives, so long as we do Teshuva properly. Now, when it comes to a human being, if I offend somebody, ask his forgiveness, he may forgive if he feels that I sincerely am going to change my attitude and my behavior. If I offend him again in the same manner, he might forgive me a second time. After a few more times, at one point, this human being stops forgiving. Now, the reason why this human being stops forgiving is because his feeling of compassion and forgiveness is limited, because he's a limited human being. But God is infinite, and therefore God's compassion for us and God's forgiveness is infinite. And no matter how many times we mess up, no matter how many times we come back and say, God, I'm never going to do this again, please forgive me, each time God forgives us wholeheartedly and infinitely, because he is infinitely forgiving. And therefore 3 times a day, in the morning, afternoon, and the evening, we ask God, please help us to Teshuva, and we say, God, please forgive us. And if we do so with our whole heart, indeed he forgives. What joy it brings knowing we have such a compassionate God who's infinitely compassionate to us. One can sin between the morning prayer and the afternoon prayer, between the afternoon prayer and the evening prayer, and then again between the evening prayer and the next day morning prayer, and each time God forgives, as long as we wholeheartedly return to God. Now, ordinarily, someone who says, I'm going to sin now because I know I can do Teshuva later. Under such circumstances, he could do Teshuva, but his Teshuva is much more difficult because in this circumstance, the Teshuva itself was part of the sin. That's ordinarily the case. But for us, that's not what's happening. It's not as if we sin knowing we're going to do Teshuva. In fact, we hope we don't sin. We're trying not to. And therefore, as soon as we actually make the move toward Teshuva, God immediately provides that help and immediately grants forgiveness in his infinite whole heart, so to speak. Now, this does not contradict the fact that simultaneously one should remember their sin. And this is for 2 reasons. Number 1, it keeps us humble. Knowing what we're capable of doing, knowing what we've done in the past, keeps us a little humble. Number one. Number two, when something negative goes on in our life, we can say, well, the reason why that happened is because of my sin. And therefore that will allow me to accept my lot in life with more joy. More on that coming in the next chapter. But remembering our sin should in no way, God forbid, impede our joy in serving God, knowing that God is infinitely forgiving and infinitely loving, and knowing that we have the opportunity to reconnect with Him on the deepest level. The takeaway from all of this is, in addition to the obvious, I'd like to point out the following. Many ask, how can one sincerely say, I'm never going to sin again? Who can say such a thing? Honestly say, I'm making a decision to never sin? I think the answer is in this chapter. At the moment when we make that decision, I'm no longer going to sin. In that moment, we mean it sincerely. And if we mean it sincerely, God forgives right away. Now, it may happen that later I'm going to sin again. That's possible. But that's not because I wasn't sincere when I made my decision. It's because I have an evil inclination and I'm a human being. What can I do? And then again later that afternoon, I'm going to again make a decision I'm not sinning again. And God will forgive. And it may happen that I mess up again. And so on and so on and so on. But it does not take away from the truth of the moment when I decide I'm not going to sin again, even if it so happens I have an evil inclination that overpowers me later. And thus God is infinitely, infinitely forgiving, and we in turn feel that infinite love and reciprocate with even deeper Teshuva. Looking forward to seeing you when we conclude chapter 12.